All right, it looks like we will get started. Welcome everyone to today's forum touching on federal updates. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Neil Zigerlicki, CEO of the La Crosse Area Chamber of Commerce. Today we have Senator Tammy Baldwin here to give us updates and let us know what is happening in Washington, D.C. and how it can relate to our area. Before we get started, I want to take this time to thank our advocacy and forum sponsors, which are Dairyland Power Cooperative, Verve, a credit union, AT&T Services, Gunderson Health System, ISG, Gensler, Quick Trip, and Mayo Health System. Senator Baldwin, welcome and thank you for being with us today. To get started, I will give you the opportunity to give an introduction and touch on what's new with you, what's going on in the Senate, and maybe what committees you're working on.
All right. I'm going to try to avoid the temptation to make my introduction too long because I do want to spend as much time conversing with all of the chamber members. But let me start with the major piece of legislation that was passed earlier this year, the American Rescue Plan Act, as it's called now. And that was clearly focused on recognizing that we are still in the midst of a pandemic, but trying to put in place really what we need to see this pandemic in the rearview mirror, which I hope and pray will be just a matter of months from now. I wanted to just touch on a couple of things. Obviously, the biggest tool we have to putting the pandemic in the rearview mirror is vaccination. I'm very proud of reports coming out of Wisconsin that show that we have already provided at least one vaccine to 37% of our population, that over 75% of seniors have gotten at least one dose, and that Wisconsin is among the top states in the country in putting into arms the allocation of vaccines that we're getting from the federal government. So we don't let them sit in the freezer or the refrigerator too long. We get them into arms at a very high rate, and I'm very proud of that. I will say, however, in terms of reality on the ground, that we've seen our cases ticking up in recent days. We have seen one day where we had over 1,000 cases, but we're seeing, 800, 700, 500. Whereas just a few weeks ago, we were in the 100, 200 range. And I believe that this is because of the spread of variants that are easier to spread. We're seeing a lower age in terms of hospitalizations, perhaps in recognition of the fact that more of our seniors are vaccinated. And that is why I fought for a provision that made it into the American Rescue Plan related to tracking variants. So we have the tests that tell whether you're positive or negative, but I think the biggest threat to our progress would be the emergence of a variant that the vaccine doesn't work against. In fact, we'd be back, like day one of a new pandemic if that were to happen, trying to find a new vaccine and looking at the harsh impacts of that. And so we, as a nation, were tracking less than 1% of our positive tests to figure out whether they were variants or the original virus that sort of base, which came out of Wuhan. But there's a variant that came out of the UK. There's a variant that came out of South Africa. There's a variant that came out of Brazil. And there's now 2 variants that have come out of California. So I was able to secure a very sizable investment to track and monitor variants. And I will tell you, during my spring recess last week, I toured a University of Wisconsin lab that is doing the genomic sequencing. And another bragging right for Wisconsin, we are tracking a much higher percentage of our positive COVID tests for variants than most other states, but now we have a CDC leader who's committed to doing this nationwide. In terms of the American Rescue Plan, there's also a couple of new provisions. There's small business related provisions, but specifically for some of the hardest hit small businesses, some of the first that had to close, some of the last to reopen. That includes very sizable investment for restaurants, bars, and breweries. We have a few of those in the La Crosse area that I know are looking at these funds. Also, there's support for live venues. Now, I want to be very cautious as I tell you about that. I know how eager live performance venues are to see some help to get them through the final months, I hope and pray, of this pandemic. But the website crashed when it went on for accepting applications on April 8th. So do not worry, the program didn't disappear. It didn't, the cyber technical difficulties will not make the money go away, but they're gonna have to work those out. And I know how, I actually talked to a venue operator who is ready to press send on the application at 11:01 Central Time, knowing that it was going to be open at 12:01 Eastern Time for new applications. So hold tight. We'll try to provide as much information about that as we can. There's also a sizable investment in state and local governments, including tribal governments. That was something that was missing from previous COVID relief packages for over a year. And we know how local communities have been stepping up. They're on the front lines of fighting the pandemic through their health departments and first responders. And we know that in many areas of the state, local revenue has been depleted, especially those parts of the state that rely on revenues from tax revenues from hospitality industry, et cetera. So that is desperately needed. And so I'm going to stop there, although there's many other provisions of the American Rescue Plan, but to sort of pivot to what we're looking at as we look ahead. So the next major examination is, how do we make sure that our overall economic recovery from this pandemic isn't sluggish like it was after the Great Recession, 7 years to get back to employment levels that we had prior to that Great Recession? And how do we carefully steward those funds in a way that makes a lasting investment? And that's where you get the American Job Plan that President Biden has put out. I want to tell you that while there's some specifics, it really is an outline. It really is a sort of skeleton. And we're going to be relying on our committees in the Senate and the House of Representatives to put the meat on the bones or to detail the provisions. And I think another thing that you're going to see in this, and this is a conversation I've had many times in the La Crosse area, is not just building back to, in terms of an infrastructure and manufacturing investment, not just sort of going back to where we were in January or February last year, but building back better. You've heard that as an expression that the president has used through his campaign and early days of his office. When I said I have many conversations in the La Crosse area about this, I think about our infrastructure impacted by extreme weather events and flooding. Many times we've had the ability to repair, but repair to the same standards as have been in place for many, many years that don't contemplate the more frequent occurrence of extreme weather events. So the idea of being able to build back better, a more resilient infrastructure, is very much embedded in the principles behind this bill. This has been sort of one of my very high priorities with regard to infrastructure, whether that be roads and bridges or water infrastructure. I am pleased to see that some of the ideas that I have incorporated into legislation are being talked about very seriously for this package, and I'm going to push to make sure they're included. The other big priority that I have that you've heard me talk about endlessly is Buy America. So the idea that when we rebuild our infrastructure, that we're doing it with US workers, US products, et cetera. The components, that there are some Buy America requirements already, but it misses so many components of our infrastructure efforts. And so we want to close those loopholes as we move forward and support the building of additional jobs in the US by doing so. In manufacturing, the American Jobs Plan would provide $300 billion for manufacturing and small business support. Part of this funding would go to fund community-based small business incubators to create a network of innovation hubs in communities like La Crosse. The plan also proposes a significant investment to build a rural partnership program to leverage our rural regions and their unique assets. I talked already about Buy America. Let me just say a few words about research and development and workforce development. The American Jobs Plan provides $30 billion in additional funding for research and development to spur job innovation and job creation, including in our rural communities. And I'm looking forward to soon introducing a bipartisan bill called the Endless Frontiers Act, which provides significant resources to our research infrastructure and would boost mid-sized communities like La Crosse by creating regional hubs of innovation. And then on workforce development, top priority for me, I think that Congress will act this year to enhance workforce development programs to match job seekers with employers. In particular, in areas of proven workforce development programs to get our students on path to careers even before they graduate from high school. I have several bills of my own that are in this arena, an expansion of apprenticeship programs to work to employers that would love to offer such programs, but find it too cumbersome to do so alone, to actually create partnerships with other like businesses, their local community and technical colleges and universities, as well as the workforce development offices, to create novel and new apprenticeship opportunities. I'm also a big fan of the programs that have throughout their history received bipartisan support, sometimes known as transitional jobs or subsidized jobs, really focused on the long-term unemployed, but allowing help to people to reduce the barriers to employment, whether that be childcare, transportation, like issues. It helps employers maybe take a chance on somebody they otherwise wouldn't, because they know that that support will be there for the first several months of that person's employment. And if successful, that they will hopefully embrace that employee in the long term. Lastly, I wanted to just share, I have a few new leadership responsibilities that I'm really thrilled about. Of course, when there's a change in Senate majority, you go from being a ranking member of a committee to being a chair of a committee. And so I have a new opportunity on the Senate Appropriations Committee. I am now going to be, or I am the chair of the Agriculture, Rural Development, and Food and Drug Administration Subcommittee. And we're very much looking to support rural communities in this role. It's historically a very bipartisan committee, and I've already met with the former chair, and we're really looking forward to working together. And that will include some of the priorities I've already mentioned, like increasing rural resiliency through infrastructure and broadband, as envisioned, and also addressing the very serious mental health challenges that we've seen in our agricultural sector, in part because of the pandemic, but in part before then because of the very difficult economic times our dairy industry in particular, but others also have endured. And I'm also chair of the a subcommittee of the Commerce, Science, Transportation Committee. My subcommittee is Oceans, Fisheries, Climate Change, and Manufacturing. And while you listen to that and say, what do all of those have in common? They really do. So it's going to be a very exciting opportunity to bring greater attention and policy recommendations in these issues to support our manufacturers and workers, to support our fresh water, and to support the climate threats that we have to our infrastructure and other sectors. So with that rather long-winded opening, I am happy to engage in dialogue.
Awesome. We do have some questions that came in prior. So I'll get started. One's a little more on a light note. But what's daily life like for you in DC, working in the office, at home? The Capitol, is it still being secured with a military presence? How are things going, and when do you think citizens and organizations will be able to return to the conference halls on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, okay, so as with DC, because I just was on a short spring break, as I mentioned, I was home in Wisconsin, and I have to tell you, there's no place like home. It was really great to be back. But I returned to DC this weekend. I am Zooming from my apartment. I would turn my camera around and you could see how small it is, but it's also messy, so I'm not going to do that. But I have my Wisconsin posters behind me to just remind me of home when I'm here. I have the opportunity, or I happen to live very close to the Capitol complex when I'm here in Washington, D.C. My apartment's just, 5-minute walk. And so I have been doing most of my meetings from my apartment. And I do have to go into the Capitol daily to vote. Unlike the House of Representatives that figured out a proxy system during the pandemic, the ruling by our parliamentarian and through our discussions was that the Senate just can't do that. So we do come in to vote in person. We also do that in our committees when there's a vote, but we can do hearings remotely. I would say every senator has a different protocol in terms of how much they're working from the office and how many staff they're allowing to come in. But the vaccination regime on Capitol Hill is pretty robust. And I think in our case, I know I'm going to start scheduling a lot more meetings in the office buildings. Public is still barred from the Capitol complex unless they're personally escorted by a member of Congress. And I think that we should start seeing that evaluated or reevaluated. This is not my jurisdiction. It'll be a public health decision, not a, but they certainly listen to us. I would say, when we're looking maybe in the late summer, early fall would be my guess. I will tell you, it's really odd to be on Capitol Hill in the spring and not see busloads of school kids coming for their field trip to Washington. I used to greet hundreds of Wisconsin kids every spring. during their spring breaks. And it's sad that they're not getting that opportunity, but hopefully soon. The security posture of the Capitol is ever changing. We had after the insurrection, we had a very sort of a very secure circumference around the complex, 7 foot or 8 foot fencing with razor wire around the whole perimeter. And it was like a block out from where the actual buildings were. So the complement of National Guard members at its height was probably around 10,000. We had way more on the Capitol Hill than we do in Afghanistan, to give you an example. Now that's down, I'm guessing it's about 1,500, and the walls are down too. So they are just there as a backup to the Capitol Police. I also just want to say that the Capitol Police are under tremendous stress still. 140 injured during the insurrection, 1 killed. And then another officer killed last week when the motorist who had access to Constitution Avenue came in attack. And so the stress level, they're working many hours overtime, and we have to address that environment of following the recommendations that we've gotten from General Honore to staff up and make sure people feel secure at work, because what they do is secure us and take care of, when it's open to the public again, all the visitors. So yeah, I've never seen, except for I was there during 9/11. So obviously there was enormous change to the security posture of the Capitol after that.
Perfect. Thank you. Joe, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question submitted in advance by a member prior to the meeting today. Has to do with voting. What are your arguments for and against requiring potential voters to present a valid ID photo and a verified signature in order to vote by mail? Or alternatively, just comment on the HR 1 reform package and its likelihood.
Okay, let me just say, with regard to photo IDs generally, I'll just make a couple general comments. So number one, Wisconsin didn't have any photo ID mandate until it's less than a decade ago. And I think we ran really great elections at the local level with nonpartisan clerks who I don't think were clamoring for that, but of course there was a concern that they be offered. What I take issue with is twofold. One is that when those photo ID requirements are so exacting that that government issued identification cards are ruled out, even though they are government issued, and you have to get a very specific one, that's problematic. And the legislature, as I recall, I wasn't there at the time, but had to go back and make sure certain veterans' identification was acceptable, and that certain tribal, Indian tribe identification was acceptable. And still many colleges and universities across our state, public ones that would have government issued IDs, theirs aren't compliant. And so you have to go through additional steps. So that's kind of number one, is you could just say a photo ID and proof of residence should be sufficient, but that's not the way it went. And that created undue burdens on certain populations within Wisconsin. Secondly, when the pandemic hit, and people wanted to practice social distancing and limit their exposure to people who might have COVID-19, it became ever more important that they be able to access absentee ballot. And with our state still having a significant percentage of people who don't have access to broadband, the abilities to upload and download and do those transactions online were limited, again, for some of the people that you would most want to protect themselves by voting by absentee ballot. So that those have all been barriers to voting in my mind. For the PEOPLE Act, just really briefly, it's quite expansive in terms of the different provisions, and very much focused on trying to make sure that we give equitable access to the ballot box for all citizens. And whether that's making it easier to register in the first place, or whether that means that states can't unduly restrict things like ballot drop boxes to 1 per county, or early voting in-person opportunities to times where it's much more difficult for people to get there, or provisions related to exposure of dark money in politics, or related to trying to create fairer redistricting maps. All, I think, are really fundamental to our democracy, and preventing those who would use partisan might to sort of push things in their direction, partisan power. I think all of those are very important provisions, and I hope that we do figure out a way to pass it.
Thank you. Another question sent in prior to, but I'll also take one from our chat. You talked earlier about provisions for bars, restaurants, breweries. But are there any provisions in the works for fitness and health centers who have also been hardest hit?
Yeah, so my understanding is that and I could be wrong, so please, if you have members who are in that industry and want to give me more granular input, I'd be happy to hear it. My understanding is that both the EIDL loans and the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, both administered through the Small Business Administration, have been that fitness gyms and fitness centers, et cetera, have been able to access those loans. But Dan, you just put on your video. Did you have something to add for me? Dan's my legislative director, by the way.
Everybody. Yeah, I mean, that's correct, Senator. As you noted, also, the other pot of funding will go that could be available is the money that will go to the state. So, the American Rescue Plan has a big chunk of money that will go to the governor, who is putting together in his Badger Bounce Back Plan grant programs that he'll then sub-award for businesses. So that's one. The idea there was that, like, for programs for some of the hardest hit businesses that didn't get specific grant programs like gyms or like wedding venues, that the state would have the flexibility to just kind of fill in the gaps there. So that's another option.
And my understanding, just to add on to Dan McCarthy's point, is that localities will have some of that flexibility also. So I don't know, that I don't have exact figures of what La Crosse can expect from the American Rescue Plan, but that one of the permissible activities would also to be looking at what you can do locally.
Fantastic. And thanks, Dan, for adding to the conversation. That's absolutely something that we can share with our members who are fitness centers. Along the same lines, I do have another question. about recovery and relief. Are there plans to allow sole proprietors that filed for PPP early to amend their applications under the new terms of President Biden's executive order?
So I would probably need a more specific like set of reasons in terms of amending plans. You know, that we have a few situations where there's some unintended consequences in terms of, say, forgiveness. I'll give you a very, very specific example that I was hearing about the other day, and then sort of work backwards through that. So there's a few industries that do, part of their business with the federal government.
Yeah.
And so if they get a contract with the federal government, there's a credit given for the PPP loan that they might have taken. And this is particularly in transportation. I don't know how many other areas of government this happens, but that credit that needs to be given precludes forgivability of the loan. And that, I think, is an unintended consequence. There's a specific regulation in DOT, and it runs counter to the congressional intent for the PPP program. We've been looking at these cases sort of case by case and reporting them to the agencies involved and telling them, first off, we believe you have the discretion to waive this. But if they refuse, we're also looking at legislative solutions to resolve the problem. So that's just one example where somebody might be able to sort of change the terms because of an unintended consequence. But really, I would encourage folks on this call, if it's a very specific question, to get in touch with, Greg, get ready to turn on your camera if I'm not catching you. There he is. Greg, my outreach director for the region of La Crosse and many other communities. Get in touch with Greg and he'll convey it and try to get specific answers. And we also want to encourage you that if, the American Rescue Plan was a really big bill. And while we're becoming more accustomed to running some of the programs that were stood up for the pandemic a year ago, there's some new stuff in there. And we're going to have, without a doubt, some snags or tweaks that need to be made. And I'm only aware of those if you share the challenges you've had with me. So please share them with Greg and he'll convey them. We want to make sure that this gets implemented as best as possible. By way of an example, in the early rollout of the PPP program, family farms found out that it was almost impossible for them to work. So what happened was they based the PPP loan on either payroll or net profits from the year before. Well, think of a small family farm that has no payroll because it's the family that works the farm. And that, say, a dairy farm, 2019 wasn't the greatest year. And many of them had net negative profits, if you will. And so I remember hearing from one couple that got an $80 loan. That's all they qualified for, is 80. Doesn't go very far during a pandemic. I worked on a bipartisan basis with Senator John Thune from South Dakota to try to fix that so that farmers could use gross revenues from the prior year rather than net revenues. And for many, that's a day and night difference. So that's the type of suggestion we can act on and hopefully get some action on.
Perfect. Thank you for the update. And it's good to know that specific examples where there's loopholes that aren't beneficial are being worked on as well. Joe, I think you have the next question. You're muted, Joe.
Geez, I'm so new at this. Ooh. What a joke. Senator Baldwin, can you share some insights into the dynamics of a 50-50 Senate? Senator Manchin seems to be the linchpin of a lot of big policy decisions. How do the Democrats stick together and get things passed? And kind of an addendum to this, do you favor eliminating the filibuster? Would you prefer using the reconciliation more, or compromise to get to 60 votes?
I'm tempted to say all of the above. So a 50-50 Senate with the vice president breaking the tie when necessary is where we are for things that require a simple majority vote. And what requires under current Senate rules, all presidential nominations require a simple majority vote. Used to be that Supreme Court required a higher threshold. That was changed in the last session. It used to be various, other rules were in place, but now it's simple majority vote for president to be able to put their administration in, and for district court and circuit court judges and Supreme Court judges. The one process for the Senate that you referenced is budget reconciliation, which means for budget-related matters, or largely budget-related matters, we can proceed on a simple majority vote. And that's how we were able to pass the American Rescue Plan, which, sad to say, there wasn't a single Republican in either House of Congress who supported that essential legislation, in my mind. We just had a ruling from the Senate parliamentarian. Much has been written about her recently because she's a nonpartisan official who serves under either majority, and yet she holds a lot of power to interpret what is reconcilable under budget reconciliation and what isn't. And she also made a ruling, I think last week, to say that reconciliation can be used more than once in a calendar year. Our budgets are usually annual budgets, so that was up to some interpretation. And her interpretation is it can be used again. We would like, infrastructure has been one of those bipartisan issues historically. When in my early days in the House, there would be hardly a dissenting vote on infrastructure. But that was at a time when the gas tax produced sufficient resources for transportation infrastructure to cover what we needed to cover. And it doesn't anymore. And there's been a failure to find alternative revenue sources that has taken on partisan tones, which I think explains how we've moved from basically being seeing all transportation and other infrastructure bills pass with overwhelming majorities to the snags we hit now, because something has to give in order to be able to fund those projects. And the president was clear that he wants this American job plan with all the infrastructure investments to be paid for. This is not emergency spending like the pandemic spending was. So given that, I think we may end up using the reconciliation process for as much of the American Jobs Plan as we can. But I can't be certain about that. And then there's many other pieces of legislation. So you ask about the future of the filibuster. I think there's sort of been three reform options that have been bounced around and are being discussed. One is to create a new carve-out like budget reconciliation for some types of legislation. Okay, that's one. Number two, return to the days of the talking filibuster, where you have to identify yourself and your objection and take the floor and command it for long periods of time to say why you're objecting. before we can move on. Most people think a filibuster is a talking filibuster, but that has been gone by the wayside for many, many years. And so that's viewed as a reform that we could adopt that would also, it'd be long and a long process for each bill as people made their arguments. But it would still allow us to complete action after all of those things have been aired, rather than just having somebody have a secret hold on a bill with a secret threat of filibuster. And lastly, the option viewed as less of a reform, but actually a repeal of that rule would be to go to a simple majority vote on all legislation. I would say within the Senate Democrats, all options are on the table. We want to get things done for the American people that have been held up for years and years and years, and we have a sense of urgency about doing so. We do not have unanimity within our caucus, as you mentioned, Professor, in terms of doing that. So there are several senators who have not yet said one way or the other how they would do this. Senator Manchin has expressed his resistance to doing anything, but earlier had expressed some support of a talking filibuster. And so we have to work that out sort of within our own caucus first. I would tell you my bottom line is, let's keep as much of it intact as possible. The talking filibuster works as a way to allow full debate, but still get to a vote. Let's do that. But the urgency with which I view some of the issues that are before us, I would ultimately support overturning it if that was the difference between not making that progress and making it.
Thank you, Senator. Neil?
Yeah, you touched on the infrastructure package that's been introduced. Roads, bridges, ports, broadband, electrical vehicles, so many different things within that package. What are items that you particularly like about it? Are there things that you may not particularly like?
Well, first of all, let me say that the infrastructure and this bill is envisioned over an 8-year time horizon. Because as you can imagine, we couldn't spend it all in a year. We don't have the workforce yet. We don't. But I think it's so forward thinking in my mind. So I already talked about resilience. Since I've been in the US Senate, I was elected in 2012, sworn in 2013. So that was like the first time where I represented the whole state rather than just a region of the state. And I remember having 2 500-year rainfall events in northern Wisconsin in the span of 3 years. And I remember traveling up to, in one case, Ashland County, Iron County, Bayfield County, and seeing the same stretches of highway totally wiped out. And, that first time I went, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe this huge amount of a highway was washed out. And in normal times, the little stream is just a little trickle. But when you get 14 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, that becomes sufficient force of water to just wipe out a whole bit of road. And too many of our standards said, well, you rebuild it just to the way it was. But we're seeing these extreme events, and I could point to many other areas of the state, yours included, where these are repeated. We have to think about how, and we know a lot of these answers, but how we move into a place where the federal government is incenting improvements and resiliency, not just repair to the standards prior. Because we're wasting a lot of money doing that. It may be cheap for the, maybe the cheaper option right away. But if you're going to have to do it over again and over again, it's going to be a much more expensive option. One of the roundtables I held in La Crosse a couple of years back, we were talking about the upstream of effects of decisions made in other communities, and can we, filling in wetlands or that sort of thing, and how that affects the flows, not just on the mighty Mississippi, but the other rivers, and how rebuilding a bridge that gets backed up, making it just a bit higher and just a bit longer span, can resolve some of the flooding and damming issues that we experience. So anyways, the 8-year aspiration is 100% access to high-speed broadband. It is not sort of specific to fiber optics versus cell versus satellite, or but to get that job done, boy, what a difference that will make for so many, especially in rural communities, but also in other communities. And then getting rid of every lead lateral in that 8-year time horizon to assure clean water, at least lead-free water for all of our residences and schools and places of work. So I'm pretty excited about those components.
I do have a follow-up question, and it really comes down to funding of that infrastructure package. There's been talks about a corporate tax increase anywhere from 21% to going to 28%. Where do you see the rate falling? Some have been in support of that, some are very against that. What do you see for the future of that corporate tax rate?
Yeah, so first, a little context. Our corporate tax rate for the tax year 2017 was 35%. And in the end, December of, I can't remember if it was retroactive or not. So let's be safe. In 2016, the corporate tax rate was 35%. In December of 2017, the Congress passed a measure that reduced the corporate tax rate to 21%. By the way, the loudest voices in advocacy for tax cuts had asked for 25%. So Congress actually gave them 4 points more than they had asked for, but that's, let's set that aside. So we saw this massive reduction, but we were all assured a couple of things. Don't worry, tax cuts pay for themselves. So we don't have to, right? And even if this is a corporate tax cut and you're focused on working people and middle-class people being able to make ends meet, and even if it's not focused on them, it'll trickle down and those jobs are going to get better and we're going to be seeing a lot of reinvestment. I'm talking, of course, about major multinational corporations, et cetera. And we saw things like Kimberly-Clark, just to name a ancient Wisconsin company, been around 150 years, although they're headquartered now in Texas, did stock buybacks and threatened to close 2 Wisconsin paper mills in the Fox Valley, one which they successfully closed, if you want to use the word successful in that context, the other of which through negotiations remained open, but they were both profitable plants. So, these are frustrations. You're going to get where you're going to hear where I'm getting on this. I think bringing it up to 28% would fund this 8-year plan, not in 8 years. Sadly, it will take 15 years. you like it when the funding source and the expenditures align time-wise, but in this case, it doesn't. That's all right. But it goes back to what I was saying about how infrastructure used to be so incredibly bipartisan until the money ran out. And then we can't get any infrastructure action because no one can agree on whether we should raise the gas tax or switch to, I'm thinking of surface transportation right now, raise the gas tax or switch to miles driven, which is devastating for a rural state like ours where people really do have to drive great distances, and penalizes people who are investing in hybrids and electrical vehicles. And so all of these are conundrums. We've got to accept a way to get about the deferred maintenance that we suffer from, and that all people and corporations suffer from an inadequate infrastructure. But I'm also in Biden's camp, which is if you can think of a better source that's fairer, that's better, I'd entertain it in a second. And I've been a sort of all options on the table person when it comes to funding our nation's infrastructure. And remembering, of course, that this isn't operational expenses, this is capital expenses. I don't want to analogize the US budget to a family budget, but the things I borrow for are my home and my car. And everything else I try not to put on a credit card, or not to put, take out a loan for. So I know that the local budgets work that way, but the federal government's budget doesn't. But I do view these as long-term investments with lots of return on investment.
Perfect. We have time for one more short question, Joe, if you have one. If not, we'll wrap up.
Okay, this will be a quick question. The staffing for small businesses is a critical issue right now. Hospitality industry is seeking firsthand people who are refusing to come off unemployment. What's being done to incentivize folks to get them back to employment into the workforce?
This is an issue that has come up quite a bit in just recent weeks. And here's the sort of unique frame that I'm going to put this in. And I would certainly welcome additional comments from your participants, especially in hospitality industry. So because a lot of our restaurants, let's just pick on restaurants for a second, are reopening with limited capacity, a lot of the jobs that they have to fill right now are not the same hours as the jobs they were offering at full capacity before the pandemic. And whereas a worker who's on unemployment cannot refuse an offer of full-time employment, like, their old boss laid them off for a while, said, once we reopen, we'll bring you back. You have to say yes if it's the same job, right? But if it is a different job, meaning say half-time, and you really need to have a full-time job to make ends meet, that's one of the exceptions to the to the unemployment rules that allow you to decline. So I think in my mind, it's going to be an issue of limited duration, but a very serious one for both the small businesses and the workers involved. We've got to figure out a way to navigate ourselves through this. I talked to a restaurant, or indirectly, someone's telling me about a restaurant manager who was trying to do just that. And the owner said, we're only serving at 25% capacity. We don't need the full staff back. We need a few part-timers. And when they were calling people who were previously full-timers, they're saying that's not going to work. So I don't know if it's, I think we have to be innovative. We have to talk about this certainly at the national level, but you know, maybe maybe there's some way to sort of make it a full-time job by half-time at this place and half-time at that place. I don't have the answers, but it's a real problem, and I pray it will be a very temporary problem.
Thank you, Senator. Neil?
Thank you, and that'll conclude today's forum. As we close out today, thank you again to our forum sponsors and advocacy sponsors. And thank you very much, Senator Tammy Baldwin, for taking the time out of your day to be here with us. Our next forum for the Chamber will be on May 10th via Zoom, where we will have state updates from Senator Path, Representatives Billings, Oldenburg, and Doyle. So we will hopefully see you on the 10th. And thank you again, Tammy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.